Everyone, this is Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and I would like to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. This is episode 28, and we will be talking about science for a more caring workplace. Today, our guest discusses one of the top 10 trending topics in the field of IO psychology, caring for employee well-being. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series, Dr. Alicia Grandey.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're doing these.
We're so glad to have you here today. A little bit more about Alicia's background. So Grandey has studied the health and performance implications of emotional labor, mistreatment, and workplace diversity for over 25 years. Her award-winning research has been cited over 27,000 times and referenced in high-profile media, including Harvard Business Review, The New Yorker, and PBS. Alicia has mentored more than 20 graduate students and has won university-level teaching awards. She's also associate editor of the Journal of Applied Psychology and the New Effective Science Journal, and the guest co-editor of a 2022 special edition of the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology on interpersonal mistreatment. Dr. Grandey just formed a new healthy, inclusive, I'm going to get this wrong. Okay, it's HIP, H-I-P, Healthy, Inclusive, Productive Workplace Initiative of interdisciplinary scientists and HR industry leaders to conduct impactful research in the new era of work. Alicia, we are so thrilled that you could join us today.
I'm so looking forward to chatting with you, Victoria, and I'm totally terrified that this is live.
This is what makes it fun, right? This is what makes it fun. And I'm glad you called that out because this episode and our most previous episode with Dr. Keaton Fletcher is a new, kind of 21st century approach to the conversation series, doing it live streaming across all of SIOP's platforms. So we know some of y'all are tuning in from LinkedIn, from Facebook, from Twitter, and from SIOP's YouTube page. These will also be available on those pages for a little while before we then make them into a podcast. So that all being said, the format is very open and conversational. We have a few questions we're going to ask that we prepared in advance. And those of y'all watching out there, use the comments function. We can see your comments. So be sure to start plunking questions in there and we'll try to answer as many as we can in our time together. So to get started with our planned questions, Alicia, you've been studying emotions and stress for well over 2 decades. Can you tell us about how you got started in IO psychology and how did you get into the emotions and stress space?
Yeah, it's weird when you say it like that. Over 2 decades. I've been at Penn State for 23 years. Wow. It's crazy. So the short answer, I think, is really typical for IO psychologists, which is that you start out thinking you're going to be a counseling psychologist or a clinical psychologist, right? That's what we know. That's what we hear about. And I knew that really interested me. I'd had my share of bullying and bad experiences. And I thought counseling was really important. And I wanted to go back and help middle school kids like I would have liked to have been helped, And then I think it was like my senior year of college. I had a class where somebody knew about IO psychology. And it was because of that person who I unfortunately do not remember. I remember it was my groups and teams class said, have you considered this? And by that point, it was too late to apply. So I had to wait a year to discover it. But I was so glad they mentioned that because we have a visibility problem. So thank you to SIOP Conversation Series for doing these and raising visibility about our field. And the emotions and stress piece, that's a funny story because I had always known I wanted to understand emotions and I was always a stressed out kid. And I just, research is me search. And then discovering Arlie Hochschild's book, the emotional labor book, it just really resonated with me. And I know, Victoria, you said you've worked in service in bars as well. And I had worked in a variety of service jobs my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I think when we pair our personal experience and someone's really cool research and we see those connections, we can create something that's unique and unique to us, but also resonates with a broader audience. And that was what I decided I wanted to do. Didn't do it till my dissertation, but I knew it was in the back of my mind. I wanted to really explore that more.
Oh, I love that. And Alicia and I were chatting a little bit before we went live. And whenever I was applying to grad schools and discovering IO psychology for myself, I was a bartender at the time, and I was always baffled by, why don't they teach us how to deal with the stress of this job, especially in this industry when you have, drunk people you're waiting on and kind of bonkers coworkers and very bad managers at times. And so your work has always been a big inspiration to me. And even I married a chef, so I'm still very involved in the service industry and the food industry. And so just super grateful that you turned this work and this emotional labor and this stress as a science to give people the tools they need to mitigate and manage those moving forward. So
I thank you for saying that. I really realized that my goal was to really raise the voice of people in these service jobs, which I don't think really had been a traditional area of study for IO psychologists, right? We tend to be more in the white collar domain. And it was a bit questionable at first. Like there was it was a bit unsure. I was a bit unsure whether it was going to be publishable for a while there, but thankfully it was. And now you see this movement towards looking at emotional labor by leaders. So it's not just service people that don't feel like they're trained. I think today, especially with leaders being pulled in so many direct managers and supervising, so many directions, so many things they're supposed to be able to do to create a caring workplace, and that they don't have training for either. And we just don't talk about emotions and work in the same sentence very often. So yeah, it's more important today, I think, than ever.
Yeah. And I think that's starting to shift as we move towards a more truly diverse and inclusive workplace and business world, because, the more diverse thoughts and perspectives and people that we have, the more that we can start focusing on different areas. Like, I've done a lot of research on women in leadership and what is feminine leadership. And I try to be that leader, but there's not very many roadmaps for that. And I feel like emotional intelligence and addressing things like emotional labor and just caring more in the workplace is where we're going. And so, speaking of which, I know that you've started to move in some other directions with your Weld Lab, so workplace emotional labor and diversity, and your recent quote unquote taboo topics with the 3 M's for working women. I am so curious to hear more about these topics and how they all tie together to affect how leaders work in today's environment.
Yeah. I've studied diversity topics for a long time, but never like explicitly. And I just decided it was time to put it in the name of my lab.
Love it.
And the funny thing too, is that I had been moving away towards more diversity related topics and away from emotional labor. I'd kind of like felt like it had run its course in my world. I was ready to let other people take the lead. And then when the pandemic happened and suddenly customer service workers were in this quandary of needing to still deal with customers face to face with masks and everything, I got pulled back in. I was like, no, we need to more than ever, the turnover, the burnout. So I'm back in that space again. But the taboo topics paper was really fun to work on. And that really came out of, again, personal experience, but also knowing the state of the science in kind of disparate domains. So going back to the caring workplace we're trying to create, right? We know that half the workforce is female, at least in most westernized countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most companies aren't designed for females' bodies, for recognizing what women may be experiencing that men don't. And when I say women and men, of course, I am meaning biologically right now, based on what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
or not gender identities per se. And so I was thinking about my experience, which was I'm on one of the 3 M's. So of course, the first question is, what are the 3 M's, right? What are the unique biological experiences of women's lives? And if anyone's listening and wants to take some guesses, it's always fascinating what people think the 3 taboos of women's lives are. Working women.
For those of y'all watching right now, we have people watching live. If anyone wants to take a guess about what these 3 M's are, can you give us a little bit more construct clarity of, you said it's 3 M's of the stages of women's lives?
It is good. That's a clue. But it's like the taboo things that are taboo to talk about at work, but that almost all women experience, at least 2 of the 3, and then the third, a good proportion of women experience at work. Yep, menopause is one. So that's good. That was a great guess, Lynn. That's my the one that I was experiencing that made me go, we don't talk about this at work. Menstruation, yes. Wow, you're on fire. Marriage, no. And marriage is because that's more about motherhood. There you go. Renee got it. So marriage is more about your partnership. But I was really interested in women's biological experiences, something that's specific to the female body. And yes, motherhood. Yes, and motherhood, because we were talking about both pregnancy and breastfeeding in this article. And both of those are female bodies changes that have a sense of shame and stigma around them at work. And when that happens, it really constrains their ability to work productively. And it also constrains their family. Ali Gabriel has that great paper showing how the culture affects how much milk they can produce for their babies, right? So so I was aware of some research on menstrual cycles at work. And I knew a couple people that were doing that. Ali Gabriel and Hilary Elfenbein were some. And then, of course, Eden King's great work on pregnancy with Mickey Hebel's lab and how people respond to women that appear to be pregnant and on breastfeeding reactions. And I just thought, wow, these three kind of fit together. You know, I knew I was interested in menopause, but there really wasn't much research on it. I knew there was a little bit on the other two. And I felt like there was a rise in interest and awareness of we need to do better at integrating our attention to physiological health indicators. There's a great paper by Ganster and Rosen about how we can think more about stress and hormones and physiological indicators. So I just felt like the time was right to have this conversation. And I'm thankfully at a stage of my career where I can take a few risks and it's okay. And that's part of the joy of tenure. So I reached out to Ali and Eden. And the other thing, and for any grad students listening, the other great part is make those connections and find those people that just you love working with, you know, find them early and often, because this paper was such a joy to write with those two co-authors. We had such a great flow. We unfortunately couldn't do it in person due to a variety of limitations. It was pre-pandemic, but we just had so much fun writing it. And each of us took like one section. And in the end, what we found in our review was that, yes, women's bodies change. Right. Okay. Women's bodies change. So menstruation, maternity, and menopause are something that it's women's lived experience.
Yeah.
But there was very little evidence that it actually constrained productivity. And if anything, women overrode, like actually overcompensated for the potential stigma and stereotypes of it, and actually performed even more, like, you know, wore themselves out trying to prove that they were not constrained. So there's a lot. So the cost of those three things are really more about the stereotypes and the stigma. It's based on people's reactions to seeing a pregnant woman at work or teaching a class. It's reactions. We were finding these newspaper articles about if a woman had her period at work and it became known how there was so much shame around that, or assumptions about, oh, she's moody because blah, 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 right? And similarly with menopause, I had a personal experience where I joked that I was having a hot flash, and the reaction I got was so no, we don't talk about that in this workspace. That I was like, okay, well, we need to study this more. So now we're looking at that in our research in the lab.
Yeah. Oh, it's so important for so many reasons. As you said, I think sometimes we think employee wellness, and we think, especially as psychologists and what people believe that we do as IO psychologists, we think, okay, mental well-being and emotional well-being, but like physical well-being is so crucial as well. And you know, especially with everything with the Great Resignation right now and people trying to keep employees around, it's just, yeah, I feel like it's just so important. And I do a lot of work with allyship, and I'm always trying to make the case that by serving certain groups, you know, the tide rise, like all ships rise, right? So if we rise the tide, all ships rise. And I'm curious, like whenever talking about the 3Ms, like how do you get men, especially male executives, interested in these conversations and make the case that it benefits everyone, not just someone who's specifically experiencing one of those 3Ms at the moment?
Yeah, it was funny when I was practicing a talk on this, and the first time I gave a talk on this, it was at EWOP, the European Work Psychology Conference, and I was so nervous because we don't talk about these things in research either, right? Not just in corporate life. And I was practicing it with a group of scholars that I know well and respect, and one of them, I'll name him because I love him dearly, and you probably know him too, Derek Avery,
Mhm.
said, so how can men be allies? Because I probably can't say, hey, I'll bet you're going through menopause. And I was like, yeah,
Not the
that's
best thing.
that probably isn't something you should say. So, I think that's a great question. I think that we're going to talk a little bit later maybe about psychological safety. And I think that's the linchpin, right? So if you're creating a culture that does a couple of things. So it creates a culture where you can be vulnerable, where you can share what's really happening in your life. You don't have to always pretend that you've got it all together, which we're all
Yeah.
going around doing, right? We're all experts at that right now. And you can actually, not all the time, right? But you can actually say, I'm struggling right now with X, or this is just today is a really tough day for me. Here's what I need.
Yeah.
Because part of the challenge is the stigma and shame around these topics means it's so sad. I mean, if all that a woman in menopause might need is a fan in her office, a cooling fan, that's it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really easy accommodation to make. But if she doesn't feel like she can ask for that change, if she's in a cubicle or, some other kind of shared space, maybe it's seen as, anyway. So, I mean, I think you have to start with the culture that allows people to be a little bit vulnerable and share what they are really experiencing without stigma or consequence, and instead thank them for sharing, because
Yeah.
that allows leaders to lead them better,
Yes.
right? If I don't know what's going on with you and you seem like you're doing fine, I can't know what you need, right? And that's true for teachers with their advisees and their students. If I look at you and you seem fine, I'm going to keep giving you work to do, right? So I'm going to assume everything's great. We have to have a real dialogue, and that goes both ways. That's why I started saying I'm terrified. Because we have to admit, like I had a student come in before and she's like, how you doing? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. She's like, oh my gosh, it's great to hear that. It's like, yeah, of course. Like, we're all people first.
Of course. Yeah. And something you said that really resonates with me is it has to go both ways. And so going back to allyship, I talk about allyship in terms of this like ongoing partnership between an ally and a partner. And turns out those roles are actually fluid. There's times where they actually flip depending on the scenario. But it's a two-way street, and the partner or the person who needs the support, whether with a leader or with an ally or all of the above, needs to be able to share those. But it's the leader's role, the ally's role, to build that psychological safety to make it okay to share those things. And so can you talk a little bit more about psychological safety and its role in creating a more caring workplace, especially from this leader or ally perspective?
Yeah. So I want to first say Amy Edmondson, psychological safety, right? I will not claim that topic, right? That is
Yes.
that is Amy's baby, and she's done a great stuff, and she's really getting it out there right now in terms of how to develop it in hybrid spaces and virtual work. She's got a number of HBRs on that, so check those out if you want to hear it from the original source. I tweaked her approach a little bit and started asking the question about psychological safety for emotions. And I wrote her and I said I was doing this, and she said, "Oh, that's great," right? Because her approach is more about sharing ideas or admitting mistakes, and so feeling safe that you can share that you need to learn more. So it's more content based.
Mm,
And so I thought more about, okay, we also need to feel safe to share how we're feeling to have a
mm,
caring workplace.
yeah.
And with most workplaces, you have that positivity requirement, right? Like, we know that positive teams are, oh, they're so high energy and they're really fun to work in. And so, of course, we want to always be positive. And that can be toxic, right? If you
Yeah.
constantly feel like you have to be positive, and that requires then suppressing how you really feel and faking, which is exhausting. And my research found that, if you can be real with one person or, your team, that protects you from that faking and exhaustion you might have to feel in other groups or teams, right? So creating a space where you can share how you're really doing. And I'm not saying going around and, blurbing out all of your complaints about life all the time, right? We have to get some work done too. But you need to actually it's like a pressure valve, and if you don't release it, sometimes it builds up and it makes us sick.
Yeah.
And I've seen that with my students. I've seen it in my own work. I was just on a call where we were trying to be productive, myself and a colleague, and I said, I have to share something with you. I'm really distracted right now by this thing going on in my personal life, and we talked about it a little bit just for a moment. She showed me some empathy and said, "Oh, I'm really sorry you're going through that." And then I suddenly found I was able, and suddenly we were brainstorming, and it was all good. I just had to remove that distraction. And I think we're just really good at instead pushing it down and not feeling it. And we've been doing that now for a couple of years with the pandemic stress that's been created. And it's tough on our bodies. It's really tough. So in terms of how to those who want to foster psychological safety, I recently did a workshop with my dear colleague, Susan Muhammad, who is a Teams expert. Mm-hmm. And because I'm not an expert in it, I could take the research she was sharing with me and make it more simpler, right? Because I don't know all the ins and outs, right? So I'm like, oh, okay. So to make psychological safety, leaders need to hit their team. Mm-hmm. She's like, what? I was like, they need to show humility, right? They don't know everything. Be open to new ideas, right? Like during the pandemic, pretending like you know everything, that must have been exhausting for leaders. Pretending that they actually know what they're doing, right? So showing humility during uncertainty, showing humility about, I don't know your experience. I'm not you. I can't assume that I know how you're doing right now. And then the second part is the I of HIT is invite input, right? Mm-hmm. Tell me, what do you need? Give me feedback on what I could do better. Give me information about how I can help you better. And then the third part of the HIT is thanking them. So if you're in a team where somebody just said, I'm really struggling, or I think we messed up, or I think we need to do this differently, I think our instant response as a leader is to get defensive because it feels like criticism. And then we might kind of shut that person down or say, well, we don't have time for that. We're going to have to move on because that's easier, right? But if we instead be like, okay, that's hard for me to hear, but I want to hear more. Tell me more. And then we let them tell us more. And then we thank them. Like, wow, without that feedback, I would have no idea. You don't have to agree with it. You might disagree, but you can thank them for that perspective. And now the rest of the team knows it's okay. Yeah. It's okay to feel. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to have ideas. It's okay to share them. And now you've created an environment and you've thanked them. You've rewarded them for it. And now you've created an environment where they're likely to do that again. Yes, thank you, Amy. Humility, invite, and thank. So it's opening a conversation and realizing what I'm saying is not easy. Yeah. And Amy Edmondson says the same thing. Creating psychological safety is not easy. It is not about making things easier. Yeah. Right? It's going to be challenging if you start to get feedback that you've never gotten before. It's a lot easier to assume everything is fine. And as I say to my students and my colleagues, fine is a 4-letter F word. Like, tells us nothing. So tell me you're fine. I'm going to maybe ask a little follow-up because I want to actually know, because that helps me lead you better if I know how you're really doing.
Humility, invite and thank.
Thank them for the feedback. Yep.
I love that. And something you said, I think it's powerful. It's not just in those one-on-one conversations, but in a meeting, in a broad, when they do the all hands, or I'm thinking lunch and learn, but actually in front of others to show I have humility, I'm inviting this, and I'm thanking the person, because role modeling is so powerful as well. And, the leaders I work with when it comes to fostering inclusion, always trying to, it's not a matter of enforcing this as much as just doing it and watching others follow your lead. And it takes both. And so I just love that HIT. So I see future memes for those tech savvy viewers out there, I see a "Hit Me Baby One More Time" Britney Spears meme breaking down the HITs. I see lots of cool things we could do with this to get people to remember.
Way cooler than me. I do not make memes. Please do. Yeah, go ahead.
I love it. And so you were talking a little bit about, just navigating wellness, psychological safety, just being a leader in this post-pandemic, we're still kind of at this pandemic workplace that we're living in right now. And I know that you're doing a new initiative at Penn State that coordinating interdisciplinary scholarship on new research and directions for the post-pandemic workplace. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how, the relationship with navigating this pandemic life and caring for our employees?
Yeah. So again, it's a wonderful place to be in one's career where one can step back and say, what do I really want to do to make an impact? And I think sometimes maybe it's harder in academia than in your world, Victoria, where you can see the impact like in that moment. But when we're working on publications that take a really long time, it's hard every day outside of the classroom to see impact. And I started really thinking about, in this next stage of my career, what do I want to do that's going to be more meaningful? And I saw a lot of leaders seeking more information about how to have caring workplaces, the theme of today, right? How, and not just that, how the questions I was seeing on LinkedIn and Twitter, how do I care for my employees who are struggling, while also meeting the demands that I am required to do as a leader, right? Meeting the productivity demands, being the leader that I think I need to be. How do I balance and not burn out myself, right? Like, how do I avoid compassion fatigue? So I started thinking about like, wow, yeah, a lot of our research is behind a paywall, right? In fact, I just saw someone was saying they can't access the link that was posted. And so how can we get what we know as IO psychologists, how can we get that out there more effectively? Because how many people are going to read that article, right? We need to do more things like this that are freely available. We need to create, I've got on one of my websites, the HIP Initiative website, we have some HBR type articles and summaries of some of the recent research on Zoom meetings, for example. Let's get it out there where everybody can access it. So this HIP initiative is part of that. I'm also working on a book of upskilling emotions for leaders, like with a consultant, right? So just trying to do more beyond the publications, which thankfully I don't have to worry quite so much about for myself. I do it for my students, right? But the HIP initiative I'm so excited. It's brand new. Just this year, we've been trying to build psychological safety among ourselves. And it's people across, I think it's like 6 different or 8 different departments and 4 different colleges, people who have expertise in biobehavioral health, who have human development, economics, business management, obviously IO psych, policy and administration, people with all sorts of different expertise relevant to the workplace and to health, inclusion, and productivity. And my thought was, okay, we know there are people that focus on one of those domains, but we don't often think across all 3. So I'm thinking a lot about, and the other part of this initiative is bringing in industry leaders who can help us make sure we're asking the right questions. So we've formed an advisory panel of leaders. This was mostly through alumni connections, which is great, bringing them back in more. So people at like P&G and Google and Pratt and Whitney and Allstate, so a variety of different industries, and bringing them in and listening to them. What are you facing right now? What science would help you do that better? And are we asking the questions we need to be asking? So obviously creating inclusive workplaces is really important. How is flexible work, right? So the need for flexibility to be remote, right? Which is important for talent attraction and retention. But how is that maybe going to have long-term effects in terms of gender and racial pay disparities? If the person chooses to be home and wants that option, and we see more women and racial minorities choosing that option, I think that's the numbers that I've seen.
Yeah.
then that's great. It's great to have that option. It's very important, again, for all the different reasons that we've talked about. But it also means that maybe they're not seen at work. And if still that idea that FaceTime is what matters, and we're having these informal social networking opportunities for those who are at work, will there be costs down the line?
Yeah.
And that will exacerbate the disparities we already see. So thinking about these kind of integrative questions around productivity, health, and inclusion, and how things like flexible workspaces might affect all three, and perhaps not all in the same direction, is part of what this initiative is all about. That's just one example of some of the questions. We're also very interested in questions about teams and inclusion within teams, and who listens to whom, and kind of more current, when you have remote work, how does that affect who listens and who talks and things like that. That's the big picture of the idea.
I love that. And it's health, inclusion, and productivity.
Health, inclusion, and productivity. HIP workplace.
I love
you
it.
Feel like I like my acronyms.
I know they're great, and that's how people remember adult learning. So, and I love the productivity. I mean, how they're all interdisciplinary, but how they all fit in together, especially for those who don't quite understand why investing in employee health, investing in workplace inclusion is good for the bottom line. There's a moral case too, but let's just push that aside for a second. As a business leader, you're going to have more engaged, productive employees, which then is that bottom line piece. So I love that it seems like this collaborative is helping build that case in a more scientific way that I'm always blue in the face talking about.
Well, and to go back to this safety part, when you have an environment where people are able to talk about what they're really experiencing, their personal lived experience, it might feel like a waste of time. I think some leaders see that as, well, that's not being productive, right? That's not a useful, that's going to take up too much time if I sit around doing that. And it does take time, but that is an investment in the long-term health, sense of inclusion, and productivity of your worker. Because if that worker has to pretend like everything's fine and work to that deadline, and then they're burnt out, they are going to jump ship. They're going to go somewhere else. They are going to get unhealthy and then have to be absent, when you're not expecting it. And there's going to be costs in terms of feeling competitiveness or not having the energy maybe to be inclusive of all people and all experiences, because when we're threatened, we tend to focus on ourselves, right? We have a narrowed focus. So the need to create time and energy for that caring, for the emotions, for the lived experience, has important contributions to all three. I firmly believe that. And that doesn't mean just feeling good. It means sitting with the discomfort that comes up due to someone's experience that may not be yours. And recognizing that is not your experience, and hearing it, having the humility to recognize it's not yours, listening and thanking them for sharing that, and then moving forward more effectively.
Oh, I love that. And it reminds me so much of the concept of centering that I talk a lot about in allyship work. And so when we have these feelings of defensiveness or fragility or whatever those negative emotions that come up, how can we check ourselves, check our biases, check our ego essentially, and center the other person? This conversation is not about me. And using that model, how do we really invite people? How do we have that humility? How do we thank them afterwards? Like, that's centering others. And then we can take that information. And something I'm always trying to uncouple for people when it comes to inclusion or diversity or wellness, we're talking about this at the team and the group level. It's not about ourselves at the moment. We benefit from it if we get it right, but how do we take it off of us and put it on others? And so I love, thinking about the centering, thinking about the humility, the invitation, the thanking. And
I think that I love that idea of centering, and it's also then worth recognizing that's a lot on a leader, right? Like the emotional demands on leaders, managers, and supervisors right now, I think, has totally increased. And like, as we started this conversation with, you're not necessarily trained, right, for that. And I think that's why maybe a lot of people avoid those conversations, is they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're afraid that they're not going to know how to handle if someone breaks down. because we don't typically deal with it, right? And that's what I'm hoping to get out there more, is how can you do that, especially if this is not your natural way of acting. And I firmly believe that if we can develop that as being more normalized and okay at work, it has trickle down effects to the rest of your life too, right? Like the way you interact with your partner or your children or your friends, like being more open and transparent about how you're really doing, which I think that there are gender norms around that I think really constrains men and their connections with people. Like we need to let men express how they feel and not, accuse them of suddenly being less than men. This is so important for all of our health and for all of our sense of connection with each other and our ability to be productive people. This is not a weakness to share how we're actually doing.
And done right, it could absolutely be a strength. And I feel like
That's
your
exactly
research
it.
continues to validate that all the time. And speaking of time, I can't believe we're almost out
I
of time
know.
here today. I could chat about all of this all day long. And a number of comments from our listeners, how inspiring this conversation is. If you want to learn more about the work that Dr. Grandey does, please check out the links that we'll include in the comments, in the description, and in the podcast recap. Dr. Grandey, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom, your pointers, the impact that hopefully these, these different models and strategies you shared could have on leaders and those trying to build a more caring workplace. Just thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
I am so grateful for you taking the time and investing in this as part of SIOP's Conversation Series. So thank you. And thanks everyone that tuned in. This has been fun.
Thank you so much. And please join us for our next conversation on Thursday, May 26th at 11:15 Eastern Time. Thank you again for joining us all today. Those of you who tuned in live, those of you listening to the podcast, we look forward to having another conversation with you again. And until then, think about the ways that you can leverage science to create a more caring workplace.